Carl Jung believed that certain psychological truths are so powerful, so destabilizing, that they don't appear randomly. They find you. At the exact moment your mind is ready to break out of the illusion you've been living inside. But here's the part no one tells you. Once you see these truths, you are not supposed to talk about them freely. Not because they are wrong, not because they are dangerous in themselves, but because the world around you is not ready for what you now see. And more importantly, it is not ready for who you are about to become. Think about that for a second. What happens when one person in the room starts noticing things no one else acknowledges? What happens when you begin to feel the tension behind polite smiles, the distance behind warm words, the truth behind carefully constructed behavior? At first it feels like awareness, but very quickly it starts to feel like isolation, because you begin to realize something unsettling. Most people are not seeing what you're seeing, or worse, they are, but they've agreed not to talk about it. And that's where the real question begins. Why would people ignore what is obvious? Why would entire groups silently agree to pretend something isn't there? Why does truth, something we're taught to value, suddenly become something you're punished for noticing? And the most important question of all, why did Jung warn his most perceptive patients to stay silent about what they saw in others? What did he understand that most people still don't? Because this isn't just about perception. This is about what happens to a person when they wake up inside a system that depends on people staying asleep. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand something that may completely change how you see your past. Why certain people reacted to you the way they did. Why you felt misunderstood in places where you tried the hardest to belong. Why being too aware started to feel like a problem you had to hide. And more importantly, you'll understand what this ability really is. Why it was never your weakness. And what it actually means for your life moving forward. But to understand that, we have to go back to the moment where Jung himself first realized what this kind of perception does to a person. And it didn't happen in a lecture, or a theory, or a book. It happened in a real case, a real person. And what he saw changed everything. Jung didn't arrive at this understanding through theory. He arrived at it through a person, a real case, a real life, at a time when his own world was falling apart. It was 1913. Jung had just broken away from Freud, the most important professional relationship of his life. Everything he thought he knew was starting to shift. And in the middle of that internal chaos, he began working with a patient who would completely change how he understood perception. She wasn't what you would expect. She wasn't delusional. She wasn't unstable. She wasn't lost in fantasy. In fact, she was painfully clear. A young woman, quiet, introverted, highly intelligent. But there was something about her that made people uncomfortable. Not because of what she said, but because of what she saw. She could walk into a room and instantly know things no one had said out loud. Not in a mystical, exaggerated way, but in a precise, almost surgical way. She could sense who was lying before a single dishonest word was spoken. She could feel grief in someone who looked perfectly composed. She could detect resentment hidden behind politeness. She could hear the tension inside a calm voice. It wasn't imagination, it was accuracy. And that was the problem, because the more accurately she saw people, the less they could tolerate her presence. She couldn't hold a job. Not because she lacked skill, but because people felt exposed around her without understanding why. She couldn't keep casual friendships because casual relationships depend on something most people never question: masks. Small, socially acceptable illusions that keep everything running smoothly. But she couldn't play along. She couldn't pretend not to see what was right in front of her. And when someone's mask is silently seen through, something instinctive happens. People don't feel understood. They feel threatened. Jung observed this carefully, and what he realized was deeply unsettling. He wasn't looking at a disorder. He wasn't treating a broken mind. He was witnessing something far more difficult. What happens when a person becomes too aware for their environment? Because here's the truth most people never say out loud. Society does not reward deep perception. It tolerates surface awareness. It encourages controlled intelligence. But real, unfiltered clarity, that's something else entirely. Because clarity doesn't just reveal truth, it disrupts comfort. And when comfort is disrupted, people don't respond with curiosity. They respond with resistance, sometimes subtle, sometimes passive, and sometimes aggressive. Not because you did anything wrong, but because your presence quietly removed the illusion they were depending on. Jung called this differentiated perception, and he didn't celebrate it. He warned about it, because the more clearly you see, the harder it becomes to belong in spaces built on not seeing. And that's where the real tension begins, because now you're no longer just observing life. You're standing outside of it, watching patterns others deny, feeling things others suppress, knowing things others avoid, and slowly, without realizing it, you stop fitting into the world you once tried so hard to be part of. To understand why this happens, you have to understand something most people never question: an invisible agreement, a silent contract that exists in every group, every family, every workplace, and almost no one realizes they're part of it. Jung called this pure state participation mystique. It's not a complicated idea. It simply means this: most people are not fully separate from the environment they're in. They don't just live in a group, they are merged with it. They feel what the group feels. They believe what the group believes. They see what the group agrees to see. And more importantly, they don't see what the group has silently agreed to ignore. Think about how powerful that is. There are things happening in every room that everyone senses, but no one names. A tension that's never discussed. A problem everyone knows exists, but pretends doesn't. A truth sitting in plain sight, hidden only because no one is willing to say it out loud. And here's the key part. This agreement is never spoken. No one sits down and says, let's all ignore what's really happening. It happens unconsciously, automatically, because it keeps the system stable, because it keeps relationships intact, because it protects people from facing things they are not ready to face. This is what holds families together, what keeps workplaces functioning, what allows groups to survive, not truth, but shared avoidance. Now imagine what happens when one person steps outside of that agreement, not intentionally, not rebelliously, but simply because they can't pretend anymore. They walk into the same room, but they are no longer inside the illusion. They see what everyone else is actively not seeing, and suddenly they become the problem, not because they created anything new, but because they broke the silent contract, because they are no longer participating in the collective blindness. And this is where things start to shift, because the group doesn't experience this as someone being more aware. The group experiences it as a disturbance, as something being wrong. Even if nothing was said, even if the person stays completely silent, because awareness itself changes the emotional field of the room. It brings tension to the surface. It exposes what was comfortably hidden. And for people who are still inside that agreement, this feels like an attack, not a physical one, a psychological one. Jung understood this clearly. He saw that most modern people never fully leave this state. They grow up, they become adults, but psychologically, they remain fused with the collective, still adjusting themselves to what others feel, still filtering reality through what is acceptable to see, still protecting the system without realizing it. And that's why truth is so dangerous in groups, not because it's false, but because it breaks the structure that holds everything together. A group built on illusion will always experience truth as a threat, not as clarity, not as freedom, but as something disruptive, something uncomfortable, something that needs to be removed. And if you've ever felt like you walked into a room and everything shifted, like people became tense around you for no clear reason, like you were suddenly treated differently without understanding why. There's a high chance you didn't do anything wrong. You simply stepped outside of the agreement, and once you're outside of it, you can't go back in. Because now you see the structure. Now you see what holds everything together. And once that becomes visible, so does something else. Why truth is not just ignored, but actively resisted. And this is where it gets even more uncomfortable. Because once you step outside the agreement, something very predictable begins to happen. Not randomly, not personally, psychologically. You become a mirror. Not the kind people look into willingly, but the kind that reflects what they've spent years avoiding. And here's the part most people never understand. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to confront anyone. You don't have to point out a single truth. Your presence is enough. Because when someone stands in front of you, they don't just feel seen, they feel exposed. Not in a dramatic way, in a subtle internal way. Something in them recognizes that what they're hiding is no longer fully hidden. And the human mind, when faced with that moment, has only two options: to look inward and face what is being reflected, or to attack the mirror. Most people choose the second, not because they're bad people, but because facing the truth about yourself is one of the hardest things a human can do. It threatens identity. It destabilizes the story they build about who they are. And when that story is threatened, the mind goes into defense. But here's where it becomes dangerous, because that defense doesn't stay internal. It gets projected outward onto you. Suddenly, you're the problem. You're too intense, too negative, too sensitive, too much. Not because you changed anything, but because you revealed something, even without trying. Jung described this as a precise psychological mechanism. When a person's shadow, the part of themselves they don't want to see, is reflected back to them, they don't experience it as self-awareness. They experience it as discomfort. And that discomfort needs a target. So the mind creates one. It assigns the feeling to the person who triggered it, to you. This is how the scapegoat is created. Not through logic, not through evidence, but through projection. You become the carrier of everything the group cannot accept about itself. The tension they don't want to feel, the truth they don't want to face, the instability they refuse to acknowledge. It all gets placed on you. And here's why it feels so confusing. Because to them, it feels real. They genuinely believe that you are the reason things feel off. They genuinely believe that your presence changed the atmosphere. And in a way, it did. But not because you brought something negative. You brought clarity. And clarity in a system built on illusion feels like disruption. So the group reacts. At first subtly, small comments, distance, a shift in tone, then more directly, criticism, exclusion, blame, and sometimes full rejection. Not because you did something wrong, but because you didn't participate in what everyone else agreed to ignore. And this is the part that hurts the most, because it feels personal. It feels like rejection, like betrayal, like something is wrong with you. But Jung made something very clear. This process is not about you. It's about what you represent. You are not being attacked for your behavior. You are being targeted for your awareness. Because in every group, there is an unspoken rule. The person who sees too much becomes the one everyone needs to silence. Not literally, but psychologically, by discrediting you, by isolating you, by making you question yourself. Because if they can make you doubt what you see, they don't have to face it themselves. And if you've ever found yourself in a situation where everything flips suddenly, where people who once valued you started turning against you, where you went from being trusted to being difficult, there's a high chance you didn't change. You just crossed a line no one else was willing to cross. The line between illusion and truth. And once you cross it, you don't just see others differently. You start seeing the system itself, how it protects itself, how it maintains control, how it turns awareness into something dangerous. And that's when you realize this was never just about people. This was about something much bigger. But Jung noticed something else. Not everyone who sees deeply sees in the same way, because perception is not just about what you notice. It's about how your mind processes what you notice. And this is where things become even more personal. Because if you've ever felt overwhelmed by what you see, there's a reason for that. Jung identified two dominant ways highly perceptive people experience reality. Two patterns, two internal systems. And each one carries its own kind of pain. The first type is the analytical perceiver. This is the person who doesn't just sense something is wrong. They understand it almost instantly. They walk into a situation and their mind starts connecting patterns, behavior, tone, timing, history. They don't just feel tension. They can trace it. They can see where it started, why it exists, and exactly where it's going to lead. They can look at a relationship and quietly know this is going to fall apart. Not emotionally, not dramatically, but logically, step by step. They can predict outcomes before they happen. And that's where the problem begins. Because when they try to explain what they see, it sounds too complex, too detailed, too constructed. People don't hear clarity, they hear overthinking. They hear negativity, suspicion, coldness, and slowly, this person learns something painful. Being right doesn't make you accepted. In fact, the more accurate you are, the more uncomfortable people become. So they start holding back. They stop explaining. They keep their conclusions to themselves. And over time, their clarity turns into silence. Now, the second type is completely different, but just as intense. This is the emotional perceiver. They don't analyze the room. They absorb it. They don't need to understand what's happening. They feel it immediately, directly, deeply. They can walk into a space and feel sadness without knowing why. They can sit next to someone and suddenly feel anxiety that doesn't belong to them. They can wake up heavy, carrying emotions they never created. And at first, it doesn't even feel strange. It just feels like life. But over time, something starts to break. Because when you constantly feel what others are suppressing, you lose track of yourself. You start asking questions like, is this mine or is this someone else's? Why do I feel this way when nothing happened to me? And the most dangerous one, who am I without all of this? Because when perception becomes emotional, identity starts to blur. And that's the real cost, not just exhaustion, not just overwhelm, but losing the ability to recognize your own inner state. Now, here's what connects both types. No matter how different they seem, they share the same hidden weakness. Grounding. Both of them struggle with reality. Not because they're disconnected, but because their mind is always somewhere deeper or further ahead. The analytical type lives in patterns and predictions. The emotional type lives in sensations and energies. And both of them can lose contact with the present moment, with the body, with simple things, with everyday life. And this creates another layer of isolation, because now it's not just people they feel distant from, it's reality itself. They forget to slow down, to rest, to feel simple things. They're always processing, always sensing, always ahead. And the world rush feels too slow, too surface level, too disconnected. But Jung saw something deeper in this. He saw that this wasn't a flaw. It was an imbalance, a powerful system that had never been grounded. Because perception without balance doesn't just reveal truth, it overwhelms the person who carries it. And that's why understanding your type is not just interesting, it's necessary. Because once you see how you perceive, you can finally stop blaming yourself for what you feel and start understanding what's actually happening inside you. But here's what Jung warned about most. Seeing clearly comes with a cost, and not a small one, a structural one. Because when your perception becomes too sharp, it doesn't just change how you see the world, it changes how the world responds to you. Jung identified 3 very specific dangers that follow people who see too much, and these are not rare. They are predictable. The first danger is disruption, not because you're trying to cause problems, but because your presence reveals them. Every group is held together by what it avoids. Unspoken tensions, ignored truths, invisible agreements. That's what creates stability, not honesty. So when you walk into that system and you see what others don't name, you don't just notice something, you destabilize it, without speaking, without acting, just by being aware. And the system reacts, not with gratitude, but with defense. Because from the group's perspective, you are not bringing truth. You are breaking cohesion. You are threatening balance. And the system will always choose stability over truth, which means eventually, you will be seen as the disruption, not the dysfunction, and that's where relationships start to break. Not because you failed them, but because you refused to ignore what they needed ignored. Now, the second danger is much quieter, but much heavier. Isolation, not just social, psychological, because once you start seeing patterns others don't acknowledge, you realize something unsettling. You're not living in the same version of reality. You can sit in the same room, have the same conversation, experience the same moment, but what you perceive is completely different. You feel what's unspoken, you notice what's hidden, you sense what's coming, and when you try to explain it, it doesn't land. It sounds abstract, exaggerated, unnecessary. So you stop. You stop sharing. You stop explaining. You stop trusting that others can meet you there. And slowly, you start carrying everything alone. The awareness, the tension, the knowing. And over time, this creates something even more dangerous. Doubt. Not in others, in yourself. Because if no one else sees it, maybe you're wrong. If no one else feels it, maybe you're imagining it. And this is how the second danger deepens. You don't lose connection to people first. You lose trust in your own perception. And that's one of the deepest wounds a perceptive person can carry, because the perception never stops. The patterns don't disappear. The signals keep coming. But now, you've been trained not to trust the very thing that receives them. And this leads to the third danger, the most subtle one, loss of self. Because when you constantly absorb what's happening around you, when you feel what others feel, see what others hide, carry what others avoid, you begin to disappear inside it. You know what everyone else is going through. You understand their pain, their motives, their patterns. But when you turn inward, there's nothing clear, no direction, no stable identity, no grounded sense of, this is me, because your attention has been outward for too long. And under that pressure, something happens. You either collapse back into the system, pretending not to see, dimming your awareness, blending in again, or you continue forward, alone, but conscious. And this is the crossroads Jung pointed to. Because seeing clearly is not something you can undo. You can ignore it for a while, you can suppress it, you can pretend it's not there, but eventually it will return, stronger, clearer, more undeniable. And at that point, you have to decide, will you lose yourself to stay connected or lose connection to finally find yourself? Because that's the real cost of awareness, not just what you see, but what you can no longer pretend not to see. And then there's a moment, not loud, not dramatic, but everything changes. Jung saw this pattern again and again. It doesn't happen at the beginning. It happens after months, sometimes years of seeing things you didn't want to see, after giving people the benefit of the doubt, after trying to explain, to fix, to understand, after being called too sensitive, too intense, too much, after questioning yourself more times than you can count. Something shifts, quietly, internally, almost imperceptibly at first, until one day you stop. You stop explaining, you stop defending, you stop trying to make others understand. Not out of anger, not out of resentment, but out of clarity, a kind of clarity that doesn't need to be proven anymore. This is what Jung described as a confrontation with the unconscious. But it doesn't feel like confrontation. It feels like silence, a strange, unfamiliar silence. The noise inside you, the constant processing, the overthinking, the emotional absorption, it slows down. And for the first time, you're not reacting. You're seeing cleanly, directly, without distortion. And in that moment, you realize something that changes everything. You were never confused. You were just surrounded by people who benefited from you being confused. Let that sink in. All the doubt, all the second guessing, all the, maybe it's just me. It starts to fall away, not because you forced it, but because the pattern has repeated too many times to ignore anymore. This is the clarity event, the moment when your perception finally outweighs your need to belong. And once that happens, you can't go back. But here's the part almost no one talks about. What actually changes is not them, it's you. Because for a long time, you were playing a role, a silent role, an invisible one. You were the container, the one who holds things, absorbs things, processes things that don't belong to you. You carried the tension, you held the emotional weight, you made space for what others refused to face, and you did it so well that no one even noticed. Until you stopped, and that's when everything shifts. Because the moment you stop holding what was never yours, it has nowhere to go. The tension returns to its source, the discomfort rises, the system destabilizes, and suddenly, people feel it. The same people who once depended on you to carry everything quietly now feel exposed, uncomfortable, triggered, and they don't understand why. But you do, because you're no longer inside it. You're observing it. And this is the real turning point, not when you see the truth, but when you stop absorbing what the truth was costing you. This is where awareness becomes power. Not loud power, not force, but something much deeper. You begin to choose what you engage with, what you carry, what you respond to, and what you simply let return to where it belongs. And for the first time, you are not overwhelmed. You are not drained. You are not confused. You are clear. And that clarity creates distance. Not emotional distance, but psychological space. Space between you and everything that used to consume you. And from that space, you start to see even more. Patterns you missed before. Dynamics you were too involved in to notice. People for who they actually are, not who you hoped they would be. And this is where the real shift happens. Because now, you're no longer trying to fix anything. You're no longer trying to be understood. You're no longer trying to hold everything together. You're simply aware. And that awareness changes how everything interacts with you. Because once you step out of the role of the container, the system has to reorganize. And not everyone can handle that. Some will pull away, some will react, some will try to pull you back into the role you left behind. But something inside you now knows. You can't go back to carrying what was never yours. And you won't. And this is where Jung stops describing the problem and starts showing the way out. Because awareness alone is not enough. Seeing clearly doesn't save you. If anything, it can destroy you if you don't know what to do with it. That's why Jung spoke about something deeper, a process, not a quick fix, not a technique, a transformation. He called it individuation. And for someone who sees too much, this is not optional, it's survival. Because without it, you don't just stay overwhelmed. You disappear inside everything you perceive. So where does it begin? It begins with something simple, but extremely uncomfortable. Separation, not from people, from what is not yours. Because for a long time, you've been carrying things that never belonged to you. Emotions, tension, unspoken dynamics. You absorb them without even realizing it, and now you have to learn how to let them go. But here's the challenge. When you've lived like this for years, you don't even know what is yours anymore. Everything feels like you. Every emotion feels real. Every reaction feels justified. So Jung gave a very specific practice, not to escape the world, but to step away from it for clarity, solitude, not as isolation, as cleansing, time where no one else's energy is present, no external input, no emotional noise. Because only in that space can things settle. And when they settle, you begin to notice something. Not everything you feel belongs to you. Not everything you carry is yours to carry. And that realization alone changes everything. Now, the second step is the one most people avoid: shadow work. Because it's easy to see others clearly, it's much harder to see yourself. Jung was very direct about this. The people who see others' shadows the best often struggle the most to see their own, because perception becomes external, focused outward, constantly analyzing, sensing, understanding others, while avoiding something much closer: yourself. And this is where real growth begins, not by questioning your perception, but by questioning your position. Where are you in all of this? Where have you been reacting instead of observing? Where have you been certain instead of curious? Where has your clarity turned into quiet judgment? This is not about guilt, it's about balance. Because the more honest you become about your own patterns, the clearer your perception becomes. Not sharper, cleaner, without distortion, without projection, without emotional charge. And this is what Jung meant by integration: not removing your gift, refining it. Now, the third step is where everything becomes practical. Boundaries, not walls, not distance, structure, because without boundaries, perception becomes absorption, and absorption leads to exhaustion. So you have to learn something new, something that doesn't come naturally at first. You can see someone's pain without carrying it. You can understand someone's behavior without excusing it. You can feel what's happening in a room without becoming responsible for it. This is what Jung called a psychological container: the ability to hold something without becoming it, to witness without absorbing, to stay present without losing yourself. And this changes everything, because now you're no longer overwhelmed by what you see. You're grounded inside it. You're not reacting to every signal, not carrying every emotion, not trying to fix every situation. You're choosing when to engage, when to step back, when to speak, and when silence is stronger. And slowly, something shifts again, but this time, it's different. You're not becoming more aware. You're becoming more stable, more clear, more centered, more yourself. And for the first time, your perception is no longer something that controls you. It's something you control. At this point, everything splits, because seeing clearly doesn't automatically lead to strength. It creates a fork, two paths, and Jung saw both very clearly, because not everyone who sees deeply becomes whole. Some people break under it, and Jung pointed to two powerful examples: two minds that saw beyond the surface, but ended in completely different places. The first was Friedrich Nietzsche. Brilliant, intense, uncompromising. He saw through illusions most people were still living inside. He saw the cracks in morality, the fragility of belief systems, the hidden forces behind human behavior. He didn't just question reality, he dismantled it. And for a moment, it looked like power, clarity, truth, freedom. But something was missing. He saw everything outside, but didn't fully face what was inside. He exposed illusions in the world, but didn't integrate the contradictions within himself. And slowly, his perception turned into something else. Not wisdom, isolation, not clarity, intensity without grounding. He became consumed by what he saw. His mind expanded, but his structure couldn't hold it, and eventually, it collapsed. Jung didn't judge him. He understood him. He saw what happens when perception grows faster than integration, when awareness expands, but the person doesn't. Now, the second example is completely different. Meister Eckhart, a mystic, a thinker, a man who also saw beyond the surface. He perceived truths that most people couldn't even grasp. Spiritual realities, inner structures, the deeper nature of consciousness. But here's the difference. He didn't weaponize what he saw. He translated it. He spoke in a way that people could receive, not because he saw less, but because he understood more. He didn't try to wake everyone up. He didn't force truth onto people. He embodied it quietly, consistently, without arrogance, without urgency. And because of that, his perception didn't isolate him. It grounded him. It connected him. It became something others could approach instead of something they had to defend against. And this is the difference Jung pointed to. Not intelligence, not depth, not how much you see, but what you do with it. Because perception itself is neutral. It can become a weapon, or it can become a bridge. Nietzsche used his perception to break illusions, but in doing so, he lost connection. Eckhart used his perception to illuminate truth, and in doing so, he created connection. One became overwhelmed by what he saw. The other became stable within it. And this is where it becomes personal, because this is not about history. This is about you. Every time you see something clearly, you stand at the same fork. Will you use it to judge, to separate, to distance yourself from people who don't see what you see? Or will you use it to understand, to remain grounded, to hold awareness without needing to prove it? Because the danger here is not in seeing too much. It's in identifying with it. Believing that because you see clearly, you are above others, that your awareness makes you different, special, separate. Jung called this psychic inflation, and it's one of the most dangerous traps because it feels like growth, but it's actually imbalance. You stop listening, you stop questioning, you stop seeing your own blind spots, and slowly you become the very thing you once resisted, rigid, certain, disconnected. So the real path is not to see more. It's to hold what you see with balance, with humility, with awareness that perception is not the truth itself. It's just access to it. And how you carry it decides everything. Because in the end, there are only two outcomes. You either get consumed by what you see, or you become someone who can stand inside it without losing yourself. And this is where something subtle but powerful begins to happen. Because at some point, your awareness stops being a burden and starts becoming control. Not control over people, control over yourself, over what you absorb, what you react to, what you engage with. This is the shift from being overwhelmed by what you see to standing inside it, present, clear, unaffected. Jung described this as the development of the observing self, the part of you that can witness reality without being pulled into it. Because before this shift, you weren't observing, you were absorbing. Every emotion in the room, every tension, every hidden signal, it all went straight through you. And over time, you started to believe that was your responsibility, to feel everything, to carry everything, to process everything. But here's the truth, it never was. You were just never shown another way to exist. So you adapted, and that adaptation became exhaustion. Now something changes. You still see everything. You still feel what's there. But there is space, a distance, not emotional distance, awareness. You notice the tension without taking it in. You sense someone's anxiety without becoming anxious. You see manipulation without reacting to it. And this is where real power begins, because now you're not inside the dynamic. You're watching it, and when you're watching something, you're no longer controlled by it. Now, the second shift is even more important. Truth. Because before, you probably felt a need to speak, to point things out, to explain, to make people see what you see, not out of ego, out of pressure, because holding truth inside felt heavy. But Jung made something very clear. Not every truth needs to be spoken. And more importantly, not everyone can receive it. Because truth without timing creates resistance. Truth without readiness creates conflict. Truth without discernment creates isolation. So you learn something new. You don't just ask, is this true? You ask, is this the right moment? Is this the right person? Is this the right way? And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is say nothing. Not out of fear, out of precision. Because real awareness doesn't need to prove itself. It chooses its moments. And this changes how people respond to you. Because instead of feeling attacked, they feel safe. Instead of feeling exposed, they feel understood. Now, the third shift is about connection. Because after everything you've been through, there's a temptation to withdraw, to stay alone, to avoid people who don't see what you see. And it makes sense because you've seen what happens when you try to connect in the wrong environment. But Jung warned about this too. Isolation is not the goal. Discernment is. Because not everyone is the same. Not everyone is unconscious. Not everyone is closed. There are people who can meet you, who may not see exactly what you see, but are open, honest, willing to grow. And these are the connections that matter. Not perfect people, not people who agree with everything, but people who don't feel threatened by your awareness, who don't need you to shrink to feel comfortable, who can sit in truth without turning it into conflict. And when you find those people, something shifts again. You stop feeling alone, not because the world changed, but because you found the right place inside it. And this is what Jung meant by conscious participation. You're no longer absorbed, you're no longer isolated, you're engaged, but on your terms, with boundaries, with clarity, with choice. And that's the real shift into power. Not becoming stronger than others, becoming stable within yourself. But there's one final trap, and it's the most dangerous one because it doesn't feel like a mistake. It feels like growth. It feels like clarity, like confidence, like finally stepping into your power. But it isn't. It's distortion. Jung called it psychic inflation, and it happens right after the shift, right after you stop doubting yourself, right after you begin trusting what you see. Something inside you rises, a new certainty, a new strength, and for the first time, you feel like you know, not guessing, not questioning, knowing. And that's where the danger begins, because slowly, almost invisibly, that knowing turns into identity. You don't just have awareness anymore, you become it. And from there, it's a short step to something else. I see what others don't. I understand things they can't. I'm not like them. And at first, it feels true, because in many ways, it is. But here's what Jung warned about. The moment you start believing that your perception makes you superior, you've already lost balance. Because now, you're no longer seeing clearly. You're seeing from above. And that changes everything. Your awareness becomes judgment. Your clarity becomes distance. Your understanding becomes separation. And without realizing it, you start doing the same thing that was once done to you. You stop listening. You stop questioning. You stop seeing others as complex. They become asleep, unaware, behind. And you become the one who knows. This is the prophet trap, not the loud kind, the quiet one, the one where you don't need to say anything. But internally, you've already placed yourself in a different category. And the problem is, this feels stable. It feels like you figured it out. But Jung saw something else. He saw that this state is just another form of unconsciousness. Because now, you're possessed by your own perception. You've stopped questioning it, stopped refining it, stopped seeing where it might be limited. And this is how growth stops. Not because you don't see enough, but because you think you've seen everything. So what's the way out? Not going back, not doubting yourself again, but something much harder. Humility, not weakness, not self-denial, clarity with openness. The understanding that what you see is real, but it's not complete. That your perception is accurate, but still human. That there are layers you haven't seen yet, stories you don't know, contexts you don't feel, depths you haven't reached. And this changes how you carry what you know. You stop needing to prove it. You stop needing others to agree. You stop needing to correct everything. And instead, you become curious again. Not naive, not blind, aware, but open. Because true strength is not in certainty, it's in flexibility, in the ability to hold truth without turning it into identity. And this is the balance Jung pointed to. Not shrinking your awareness, not exaggerating it, holding it lightly, steadily, without needing it to define who you are. Because the moment you no longer need to be the one who sees is the moment you actually see the most. And if you stay on this path long enough, something unexpected happens. The struggle begins to disappear. Not because you see less, but because you no longer fight what you see. This is the stage Jung pointed to as true integration. Not control, not suppression, alignment. Because now that your perception is no longer a burden you carry, or a weapon you use, or even an identity you protect, it becomes something else, a presence. A quiet, stable presence that changes the space around you without force, without effort, without explanation. This is the moment you stop trying to be understood and start simply being. And that shift is more powerful than anything you could say. Because people don't just hear you anymore. They feel you. The anxious person feels calmer around you, without knowing why. The manipulative person feels exposed, without being confronted. The one hiding pain feels safe, without being asked questions. You're not doing anything. You're not fixing. You're not analyzing. You're not absorbing. You're holding space. And that's what Jung meant when he described the individuated person as a bridge. Not someone who escapes the world, not someone who rises above it, but someone who can stand between two realities, between what people show and what is real, between the conscious and the unconscious. And instead of forcing change, you allow it, because your presence creates awareness, and awareness creates movement, naturally, without pressure, without resistance. This is quiet power, not loud, not dominant, but undeniable. You don't need to convince anyone. You don't need to explain yourself. You don't need validation, because you are no longer reacting to how others see you. You are rooted in how clearly you see, and that stability changes everything. Because now, you don't shrink to make others comfortable, but you also don't push to make them uncomfortable. You simply exist in truth and let others respond to it in their own time. This is influence without force, impact without pressure, connection without losing yourself. And the most surprising part is how effortless it becomes. Because once you are no longer trying to prove your awareness, you don't need to defend it either. You just live it. And over time, the right people recognize it. Not because you told them, but because they feel it. And that's when you realize something you couldn't understand before. You were never meant to fight the world. You were meant to stand clearly inside it. And that alone is enough to change it. And now, we return to the question that started everything. Why did Jung warn those who see clearly to stay silent? Not because they were wrong, not because what they saw was dangerous, but because of something much deeper. Because once you see clearly, you don't just change your understanding of others. You change your place in the world. And that shift comes with a price. Not everyone will follow you there. Not everyone will meet you there. And some will resist you just for standing in it. But here's what you need to hear now, clearly, directly, without doubt. You didn't imagine it. The patterns you saw were real. The tension you felt was real. The moments where something felt off, even when everything looked fine, those were not overreactions. They were signals, accurate ones. And the reason it felt so confusing was never because you were wrong. It was because you were surrounded by people who needed you to be. Let that settle, because this is where everything changes. Not in how you see others, but in how you see yourself. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" And you start asking, "What am I noticing that others are choosing to ignore?" That one shift breaks years of self-doubt, but it also reveals the truth most people try to avoid. Awareness is not comfortable, it's not easy, and it's not something you can turn off. Because once you see, and there is no going back to unknowing. That's the cost. You lose the ability to pretend, to ignore, to stay in spaces that require blindness. You lose comfort. But what you gain is something far more valuable. Clarity, real clarity. Not forced, not fragile, stable, grounded, yours. And from that place, you no longer need permission to trust yourself. You no longer need validation to believe what you feel. You no longer need others to confirm what you already know. Because now you are aligned with your own perception, and that changes everything. You stop chasing acceptance. You stop trying to fit into places that require you to shrink. You stop explaining yourself to people who have no intention of understanding you. And instead, you begin to build something new, a life that matches what you see. Relationships that don't require you to ignore reality. Spaces where your awareness is not a problem, but a strength. And this is the part Jung wanted people to understand. Your ability to see clearly was never the issue. The environment you were trying to use it in was. Because in the wrong space, your perception feels like a burden. In the wrong relationships, it feels like a problem. In the wrong system, it feels like something you need to hide. But in the right context, it becomes something else entirely. Guidance, precision, strength, and most importantly, truth you can actually live by. So no, you were never too much. You were never too sensitive. You were never the problem. You were simply aware in places that required you not to be. And now, you have a choice. Not whether you see. That part is already decided. But what you do with it. Will you shrink it to fit into spaces that don't deserve it? Will you doubt it to stay connected to people who can't meet you? Or will you finally trust it, build with it, live from it? Because this isn't just about understanding. This is about direction, about who you become once you stop betraying what you see. And maybe this video didn't find you by accident. Maybe you were ready not to see more, but to finally trust what you've already seen.